Well, I'll begin by asking Tom Bottomore to make his comments.
These comments really follow on from Edward Thompson's and are really to be taken in conjunction with his. And they concern Maurice Godelier's paper largely. There are 3 or 4 different points that I want to raise, which are similar to the points Edward Thompson raised, but from another point of view. And the first of them concerns this relation of infrastructure to superstructure, or this whole problem of base and superstructure. I would say, first of all, that the preliminary points that Maurice Godelier made, the main preliminary point seems to me a very important one. That is that in talking about production, we're not talking about something which is a purely material process. We're not therefore talking about base and superstructure in terms of what is a material process and what is some sort of process in which ideas are prominent or preeminent, but that the process of production and therefore the relations of production have a material and an ideational character. And that is a view that I find very acceptable, but which I also find to be in the main Marx's view. That is to say, simply, from my point of view, the most plausible interpretation of what Marx, regardless of particular individual passages and text, was saying. But that doesn't resolve the whole problem, to my mind. If one's asking what is distinctive in Marx's social theory, because what we have to distinguish is the character of the process of production, which has this material and ideational element or elements, and, so to speak, its outcome, what this process of production actually produces. And what is characteristic of Marx's thought there, and I think inescapable, is that this process of production, which is not itself a material process, but a mixture in which ideas play a part and are inseparable from it, this process of production, nevertheless, is a process of the production of material life. And that is a fundamental idea in Marx, which I think is inescapable if the theory is to retain a distinctive character. So that although the process itself has diverse elements in it, it is a process of producing and reproducing material life. And the phenomenon that we have to analyze, therefore, is the production of material life. That is, we have to give a sense to the expression material life. What is being produced by this process? And I don't want to embark here upon an analysis of this. I merely want to stress the importance of this concept of material life as what is being produced and what is fundamental in the whole process of society and its development. And I would only say that it seems to me that one could say, one could put the expression material life into other terms and say that what is the fundamental process for Marx is the interaction between human society and nature, including, that is, a physical external world, including man's own nature as a physical being. And that a crucial and in some ways fundamental idea is this interaction between society and the world of nature, physical nature. And that this is what is meant by talking about the production and reproduction of material life as a fundamental process in society. To say that again is to raise, I think, in some way, what seems to me difficult to dispose of, however much one would like to do it, the question of base and superstructure. This idea and this distinction is open to all the objections that Edward Thompson has suggested, but it can't simply be thrown out in its entirety, it seems to me. And in a way, one reintroduces it simply by saying that there is a fundamental process, namely the production of material life in human societies, which somehow has a governing influence upon the development of these societies. To say that it's fundamental is to say in some way that it's the basis or at the base of human social life, it seems to me. The question that then arises from this is how it's to be conceptualized, this fundamental importance of this process of production. And obviously a well-established and conventional and now much criticized way is to talk in institutional terms, that is, to talk about the economic system or the system of production, and then to talk about other institutional features of society, to talk about kinship, about politics, about the cultural realm, and so forth. And this has all kinds of disadvantages, this particular conceptualization, since it can lead to a sort of mechanical view of the relations between these different parts and so forth. But how has the criticism of it actually arisen in the way that Maurice Godelier presents it? It seems to me it arises in this way. What he wants to say, and does say in the paper, is that to talk about the economic system, to talk in institutional terms, is to say that what is fundamental and by implication predominant in every society are these strictly economic relationships. And he doesn't want to say this because there are societies in which the predominant relationships are not economic ones, but those of kinship, say. And he goes on from this to say not only are kinship relations in some societies apparently predominant, that is, they are the most important, the most significant form of social relationship among the members of a society, but in other cases it might be politics or religion, or it might be, it seems to me, interpreting Keith Hopkins' paper, one could say that in some cases military relationships might be the, in some sense or other, might be the dominant relationships in a society, might give the character to this particular society. I'm not sure about all this. It seems to me obvious in the case of kinship that one has to deal with this question. In the matter of religion, I'm not so convinced in spite of Maurice Godelier citing Dumont, because in spite of Dumont it's not, it appears to me not necessarily the case that the most important relationships in Indian society are expressed in religious terms or are defined by religious notions. I mean, that is in itself empirically and historically arguable. But the case of kinship seems fairly clear. So that is that these relations are predominant in certain kinds of society which one can specify. And so the solution to the problem, which you might think either is a genuine solution or a kind of trick, depending on how you view it. Now, Ernest Gellner in some ways seems to think of it as a kind of trick to a certain extent. That is to say that these relations of production do not necessarily in every society take an economic form. That is, they can take the form of kinship relations or some other kind of relations. They can be expressed in diverse ways. And so one substitutes for the idea, say, of a hierarchy of institutions, a hierarchy of functions. But I find this notion very difficult because whereas institutions are specified, and one knows what one is talking about, that is, about an economy or about a polity or about kinship or so on, In the case of functions, one doesn't know. I mean, it's all very well to talk about a hierarchy of functions, but what are the functions which are in this hierarchical order? I mean, what are they as against, say, kinship and so forth? It's too vague, to my mind, to substitute for institutions functions unless one says what these functions are. Is one going to specify the various functions in a society in some non-institutional kind of way and then say that the basic relations of production can clothe themselves, present themselves in the idiom of any one of these functions? That's an initial problem I have with this idea. The second is the question of hierarchy. I don't see, in fact, that we're departing very much from a sort of classical model. What does it mean to have a hierarchy of functions? It's rather like the hierarchy of institutions. We want to say that some elements, some relationships have a greater determining effect than others. In the end, we want to say, presumably within the framework of Marxist thought, that the relationships that have a determining influence are those which, however they are expressed in whatever language or idiom or set of symbols and so on, whatever particular relationships, the way they're formulated, the most important are those which have to do with the system of production, with the production and reproduction of material life. It seems to me we're back at the same problem. We have to decide whether we talk about institutions or functions, whether there is a hierarchy of causes, whether there are fundamental, generally determining causes and how they're related to the others. Otherwise, it seems to me quite right to say what Ernest Gellner said, that if you give up this hierarchy of causes, you lapse into descriptivism. You've got nothing. It's just a sort of picture of a society without any causal connections, without any statement of what are the causes at work. And it's certainly very far from Marxism. So I conclude from all this that unless one can advance still farther along this route of qualifying in some way, making more sophisticated the idea of the relation between not levels and instances but functions, unless one can produce some more intellectually satisfying kind of hierarchy of causes, one hasn't escaped from the problem inherent in Marxism of what are the determining causes of social development. And always one is led back to what seems to me a problem that cannot be pushed aside. What is the role of this production and reproduction of material life, which in a crude way one can talk of as the economic system or the organization of economic relationships dealing with resources, labor and circulation in a society. But that's the first and basic problem that I have. The questioning of this idea of functions in place of institutions, and the questioning of this idea of a hierarchy of functions and how this differs from talking about institutions at different levels. A second point, which I'll only mention because part of it was said this morning, concerns ideology and what ideology is contrasted with, namely science or theory. It seems to me that beyond this sort of analysis, one's also got to ask questions about how ideology or whatever is contrasted with it, science or theory, actually appear in a society. That is, it's not enough to say that thought divides itself into two spheres, that is, ideology and non-ideology or science. One wants to know also, and it seems to me very important to know from the point of view of social change, how ideologies are produced and how non-ideology is produced. That is, how science or theory is produced. So that from the initial discrimination between them, it's necessary to go on, I think, to ask what their manner of production is, and I think also to relate this, as Marx quite definitely does, to the production of material life. This is another aspect, perhaps the other aspect, of the total production and reproduction of society. That's the second point, but I won't elaborate on that because we had a discussion this morning. The third point, again, I'll be very brief. I intended to say more about this, but Edward Thompson referred to it. In the latter part of your paper, and again in the discussion this morning, you refer to domination and power and the theory of power. I think that's the very point where it's essential to introduce the notion of class, because domination is not something that one wants to conceive abstractly, and certainly I would think not within Marxist thought, but domination is the domination of some groups by others. And this domination is, in effect, in Marxism, the domination of some classes by another class. And the problem that arises is not simply that of which you put, which arises, I think, out of the abstract notion of domination, that is, the element of violence and consent in this, which I think was usefully elaborated by bringing in the idea of reciprocity as an additional feature or something connected with consent. That is, people consent because they get some benefit in return. Whether it's an equivalent benefit, whether there's equal exchange, that's another matter, but they get some benefit. Well, that's an important aspect, the part of violence and consent in domination. But it's not the only question that arises, and certainly not within Marxist theory. The question is, who dominates whom? And this question can only be answered in terms of classes. And that seems to me to raise an enormous problem, because one has to decide then what are classes, you say. I mean, you can have a purely tautological thing, which I think is what Ralph Dahrendorf once produced, to the effect that every dominant group is a class, you see. I mean, you define a ruling class by saying it's dominant. That's also a characteristic feature of some theories of elites, that you don't have a problem of saying what a class is, because a class is simply that group of people who are dominant, and dominance is in the same way the dominance of a class. But that is not Marx's theory. Marx's account of this whole subject is intended to be explanatory. It shows, it doesn't define classes as those who are dominant. It shows how specific classes defined and accounted for in some other way do actually become dominant, how it is that they exercise their rule. And it tells you also something about the origins, the genesis, and the part in society of those classes which are dominated. It seems to me, therefore, that to talk about domination at all, one's got to have some theory of classes within this Marxist framework, and to get away, not to get out of the problem simply by saying, you know, every dominant group is in some way a class. I think you mentioned a case which I'd forgotten. I've forgotten the name or the location, but of 50 people, you know, and you said, is this a class? You see, and that's an important question. Is it a class or isn't it? And I mean, one can't say it's a class because it's dominant, but there must be some criteria for what are classes and what are not classes. But that also leads to another question. There is domination in society which is not class domination. And the important question would be, over the whole range of what Marxism deals with, that is the whole of human social history, it would be important then to see the instances, the situations of class domination and those of domination by, in some way by groups which are not classes. And to ask what other groups and in what ways can become dominant. So I find in the discussion of domination some quite serious limits, although I take the point you made in replying to Edward Thompson that you have discussed the question of classes elsewhere. Nevertheless, it seems to me essential to relate it to domination. The last point I would like to raise is still more general, and that is, explicitly in your paper, you are not concerned with social change. Marxism, Marxist social theory, seems to me to have the advantage of doing what I think every good social theory should do, that is, at the same time, to tell us, in principle, how a particular society is constituted, what its character is, why it exists, and how it exists in the form that it does, and also how it changes. It doesn't consist of it is not a theory just of given social structures and how they work, or what their principle of order or of organisation is, but it combines two things. It tells us specifically what a given type of society is, and also how it changes. It includes this account of social change. It provides a very general, not just a model, but a theory of social change. And I think that from the point of view of this conference, we perhaps haven't discussed enough that aspect of it. I would like to see the implications of what you say for social change. And that leads back to several of the points that I've made. The principle of change somehow must be related to this fundamental feature of society, the production of material life. The principle of change in Marxism seems to me to be inescapably associated with that idea of the fundamental importance of the production of material life. And the theory of change which is embodied in it must include something about how that production of material life changes and gives rise to definite forms of society. But that would lead us on also to consider two other things which I briefly mentioned. One is, first, the role of social classes, which in some way or other are engendered, according to this theory, by the changes in the way that men do produce and reproduce their material life. And secondly, by the force of ideology on one side and of science on the other. A theory of change in the Marxist kind would have to include, as a large part of it, the production of ideology, in whatever sense one's going to attribute to that. And I attribute to it mainly the sort of sense that Kolakowski does in distinguishing between ideology and theory. That is, that ideology is in some way or other an expression of the attitudes and values of particular social groups, including, as some of the more important social groups, social classes. But both this and that is the development in some way or other of class consciousness and the consciousness of other groups in definite forms of society. Both this and the other part, the production of science, are very important in accounting for social changes. And to present Marxism as a theory of change would involve looking at at least these three aspects, that is, the underlying impulsion in some way, the fundamental impulsion to change which exists in human societies, which is given by something one can loosely call the economy, or the system of production, classes, and then the productions of thought, which are partly ideologies and partly science. And it seems to me that we should be led then into a discussion of this as a theory of change to which others could be opposed. I would like, in fact, I don't know whether this is going to arise, to say some more about, or to have some discussion of, models as against theories of social change. What are we looking for in models? Perhaps a set of categories about things, a set of ideas about things to be taken into consideration. It seems to me more important, perhaps, to discuss theories in which particular things are taken into consideration and are treated in a definite way, so that one's presented with statements about social change which can be challenged, opposed by other theories and so forth. Whereas in the case of models, one could get a very general and agreed model which was just a kind of framework within which one would go about thinking of these questions. To conclude, Marxism, to me, is not a model of social change, it's a theory of social change.
Ernest Gellner, and then if you want, Maurice Godelier.
Well, Tom's contribution seems to be the absolute at the heart of the matter, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to comment on it. Seems to me contemporary sociologically interested conscientious Marxists, such as our present at this table, basically have two options. They can either be revisionists and keep the Marxist bottles, but put rather non-Marxist, more permissive and liberal wine into it, which is one way out. And then, of course, the trouble is the stuff is true, but it's not distinctively Marxist. Or one can have, I mean, Tom's Marxism seems to be genuinely mise en bouteille au chateau. I mean,
Thank you.
and then I may mix my metaphors, get one into it, and know where one is disagreeing. And that's why I think it's a heart matter, because it remains distinctive, it remains arguable about, and one knows what is being said, and one knows why one is disagreeing, and that also seems to me enormously interesting. And there are two or three points at which the disagreement seems to be crucial, and it's abstract but very fundamental. And of course, it's fundamental both for sociological understanding and in terms of current moral and political issues. Now, the crux, of course, is this business about whether you have a theory about an identifiable economic substructure. Now, not only, and of course, Tom holds to this, and I think not necessarily that there's another one, but that one hasn't been established and it's an inadequate theory. And the one point where I think one can put one's finger on a mistake in the actual exposition and the actual argumentation is that there was a kind of slide. He said quite correctly that the social system, I'm not using his words, but I'm trying to refer to his ideas, the social system must be concerned with the reproducing of the material form of life. Well, indisputably so. Any social system which persists, to say that it persists means that those people or their offspring or their adopted offspring or whatever are still there. The means must be reproduced. Now, this is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what is crucial in the mechanism of achieving this. Now, it seems to me that for most of human history, it's at least arguable that the means of coercion and sometimes the means of conceptualization were more important. Of course, the end result has to be to produce a material precondition of life. People have to have something to eat. That's not in dispute. But the way in which people are constrained into doing what has to be done to achieve that, the means by which they are constrained to accept the distribution, I think Maurice Godelier stressed, the way in which this is done seems to be by no means obvious that this is done by economic mechanisms. And this, it seems to me, where this is at the heart of the matter, and of course it's both a sociological and a moral issue, because for the great problem for Marxists in the political sense, of course, is what went wrong, how was Stalinism possible, and you can only cope with that problem if you think about the problem of power. And the great tragedy is like his contemporary Russians, that they're trying desperately to cope with this, and have, as long as they keep within the permissible terminology, they have no damned idiom in which to do it. This is the damned Marxist heritage which inhibits them in coping with their own problem. That, by the way, that doesn't directly concern us. The way this mistake occurs seems to me where Marx went wrong. Now, it seems the errors of Marx often, it seems to me that the finger has been put on his wrong errors. The Jewish and the German ancestor of Marx, so to speak, the biblical, the prophetic element and the Hegelian element are very familiar. It seems to me that the host country of Marx, his and mine, must also take some of the blame for his mistakes. This is not so widely appreciated. His errors seem to be distinctively British or Scottish. That to say the whole idea that of the economy being predominant, to schematize, is an error which he shares with liberal economics, with the laissez-faire school, with Adam Smith. His errors are something he shares with Adam Smith. The whole idea, and this of course was encouraged by the very peculiar, speak with trepidation of the present historian, the very peculiar thing about the British 18th and 19th century situation was that it looked that the people who had access to the sword, for various reasons, neither wanted to nor could interfere with the people who are producing wealth, who could go on producing wealth, who weren't obliged by their social situation then first, the moment they had it, to turn it into swords or into followers. There's something that the whole separation of economy and polity is something very characteristic for early capitalist industrialism, is not true for most of mankind's history before, is no longer true now. Is one of the reasons, I mean, the errors of Milton Friedman are roughly the same as, again, there's the assumption of something, an autonomous economy. I mean, if one were to do this in terms of a concrete, of a concrete example, Alan Kahn doesn't seem present, but I imagine he may be watching on the screen. I recently had occasion to read with a great deal of care his book on social transformation in a part of Nepal, and the transformation, roughly speaking, from slash and burn to rice growing, from shamanism to Buddhism, shamanism to Hinduism, and so forth. And it doesn't fit what Tom said toward the end. It isn't a case. It's a very radical social change, demographic and other, but it isn't a byproduct in the independent initiating factor in that change is not a change in the means of production in any concrete sense. It's a change in a new combination of the means of coercion, a particular combination of a ruling class providing leadership and ideology with a recruitable would-be peasantry who, in return for military service, is allowed to expand rice production and so on. The whole thing isn't an economic innovation because, as Alan Macfarlane describes, the technology involved what had always been available. There was nothing new there. There was no technological innovation. It was a combination of political and ideological factors which resulted in very, very fundamental and rapid social change. So it seems to me a case of if one takes Marxism in a concrete, specifiable sense, a fascinating counterexample. On the whole business of economy and polity, I remember an article by Moses Finlay in answer to the question, why did Aristotle not write about economics? Why did Chapter write about everything? Why did he miss it out, so to speak? And it seems to me that was the wrong question. The right question is, why did economy, which is not an independent subject, become an independent one in a given period? It's sort of in reverse. Aristotle was right not to bother about it. The question is, why did Adam Smith think there was such a subject? That's the one other specific criticism I would make on Tom's reasoning was, again, when it comes to the business of class. Of course, one mustn't define class one mustn't assign classes tautologically. Of course, one must, when there's domination and inequality, one must be interested in this. But he never mentioned the fact that, after all, the Marxist definition is class in terms of relations to the means of production. If he was using class in that sense, it seemed to be by no means obvious that in cases where stratification and differential social position is important, there are classes. Quite frequently, crucial classes are defined precisely in relationship to the means of production. I beg your pardon, to the means of coercion. And this is where I follow up Jacob's West African State book. If you refrain it in that form, or at least leave it open, whether it's coercion or production, which is crucial, then of course there's no disagreement. Sorry, so long, Mr. Chairman.
I'll ask Maurice Godelier to comment briefly, and then Sally Humphreys, and then we'll move on to the next part of the session.
Well, I am a bit surprised with Gellner's statement, because first he's speaking about the economic structure as if it was separated from something else. It should be separated, so he is ethnocentric in the first part of his statement. And after he says, look, I don't understand Marx because it took a peculiar case, it means the capitalist society, and he tried to apply what he was seeing in a capitalist society to other societies. In fact, as far as I know Marx kept saying that really, except in the capitalist society, nowhere there was such thing as a separation, an exclusive economic institution. Because only in the capitalist society, the workers are totally separated from the means of production and free. It means free. It means the cohesion does not come from sword, but from the fact that you have nothing except your labor force. So you are forced by only economic constraint to go every day to the factory and to get something to live. You have no policeman, no sword, no landlords, no royalty or nobility in front of you. For the first time in history, you have free people without any means of production. First thing. And secondly, what says Marx? It is, I am not going to find classes everywhere. Read the books, read Forman, the text on pre-capitalist forms of production. He says that in the antiquity, the goal of the peoples were to reproduce themselves as citizens. So not to buy material goods, but to reproduce themselves. That is material life. It is to reproduce himself as a citizen, to reproduce materially himself as a citizen. So in fact, what was the discovery of Marx? You can say it was not a discovery, it was just an error. Marx did understand, through the specificity of the case of capitalist society, the importance of economic foundation of social life. What I've said, Bottomore. So, it is an epistemological discovery through the unicity of the case of the capitalist mode of production. It was not just to share the liberal attitude of Adam Smith and Ricardo. That is Louis Dumont's statement too. Through this specific case, something was visible for the first time in humanity. The importance of economic foundation of social life and the importance of the appropriation of nature in order to understand the creation of social forms of social life. Social life. That was the discovery. And Althusser is wrong when he is speaking about a chiasma, an epistemological, what he says, une barrière gap, break. The break is not in the mind of Marx. The break is that for the first time, the capitalist society makes something clear to the mind of man. It's the importance of the appropriation of nature and of economic foundation of social life. For the first time, it was clear. And I agree with you against Moses Finlay. Moses Finlay was wrong, because Aristotle does perfectly speak about economics. Because he speaks about economics where? In La Politique and in ethics. Exactly when you are a citizen, you speak about economy from where you are a citizen. So it is when you deal with politics and with the structure of a city, and with the behavior of somebody in order to reproduce his status in the city, ethics. I think Aristotle was perfectly aware of what was economy. In fact, because economy was not existing as such, separated from politics. So he was dealing with economy when he was dealing with politics. So when I read Aristotle, I see he's dealing perfectly with his own structure, his own relationship of production and so on, to me at least. So the whole argument of Moses Finlay about he could not understand, and Schumpeter's too. It is a discussion with Schumpeter, in fact. But that is casual fact, in fact. Now I come back to Tom Bottomore's. Yeah, but I was also, asked to answer. First, I have defined functions. I am very surprised you did not read page deeds. I say, I call relationship of production any relationship who fulfill three functions. And I went to define, it's what I can do. Function is defined here to determine the social access to resources and control and so on. That is defined. I mean, a function is not something vague. It's something very explicit. What relationships do, what social relationships do, and I define what they do. And so I have no substantive definition of economy. I have a functional definition of economy, and I give the three functions which make social relationship of production. Maybe I am wrong, but at least it is clear.
Well, I think there's a misunderstanding which I'd like to ask you about, because when you speak about the hierarchy of functions...
that is the second point.
Are you only speaking about those three functions?
No.
No, because I quite agree. I mean, I understand
so now,
that
your first point was there is no definition of functions. It's
in
vague.
The hierarchy.
It is too vague to substitute function to institutions. I define economy, relationship of production. I have used even the German quotation, what is economic structure? And I say economic structure is relationship of production. Relationship of production is anything which fulfills three functions. When I speak about hierarchy of function, it's quite different. I speak about what was saying Ernst Gellner, in fact. Social relationship dealing with these three functions, it's relationship of production. Authority, control of the person, and so on, what you would call politics maybe, and maybe thought at the end, But I am very careful with these things. But when I deal with hierarchy of function, I don't deal with these three functions, but with the relationship between political setting of a society, fabric of a society, control of the masses, control of the peoples, authority, constraints, and this institution fulfilling these three functions. It's different. Hierarchy of function does not mean hierarchy between these three functions, but hierarchy between relationship of production and other aspects of social relationships.
Yeah,
for instance, to deal with kinship is to deal overtly with marriage and descent. These three functions, these two functions of marriage or kinship relationship, you cannot reduce to relationship of production, and you cannot deduce from relationship of production. Cannot reduce, cannot deduce. So, but officially, clearly, universally, kinship is dealing with marriage and descent, and that you cannot reduce to. And this is irreducible. It's what I take as function. So, well, first point. Second point now. Class domination. Who dominates whom? Well, I think I have answered to you this morning about that, because I have been dealing with, and I mentioned that page 56 and page 57, I was dealing with the problem of the appearance of class in history, in archaeology, and mentioned we know on the map of the world where and when the first state societies did appear. We know that now, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and so on and so on. And what I want to, so I am not just dealing with abstract ideas. I should like to be able to deal with archaeological and historical data, and then mention in 2 pages these things. But I mentioned historical necessity. What I call historical necessity is something which is not possible to do, what was said this morning, historically. What is unthinkable, unfeasible, unmakeable historically. And I mentioned yesterday that it was not possible for the slaves to have a political consciousness of themselves and to have political fights, to take the political power in order to reorganize society. That is what we call limitations of the process, the overall limitation. So it's what I have tried to do. From contradiction, I have said, you know, it is in my paper, contradiction, limitations.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up this point about the difference between models of social change and theories of social change, which seemed to me a very useful one. And I would take the difference, I mean, you know, the relationship to be that in the sense in which theory is being used here, a theory states what kind of models are acceptable and what models are supposed to contain. So that with Keith's model this morning, any questions about the relationships that he was postulating or about certain historical facts that he, that were implied, that he ought to have treated of in terms of the relationships that were included in the model, were criticisms of the model as a model. But saying this model seems to start out from a set of values without explaining the set of values is a criticism from a theoretical point of view. It's saying that my idea of a theory of social change wouldn't start from that. And I think that it's important to make that the alternative between theory of social change and pure descriptivism is wrong. I mean, that the alternative to a theory of social change which has a hierarchy of functions is in fact historicism rather than descriptivism. That's the difference between analysis and description has got nothing to do with it. The alternative to having a hierarchy of functions or hierarchy of causes is simply to say that where you start and stop your models will depend on your kind of interests you have, the kind of question you're asking yourself, that there can be no general theory about what any account of social change has to include, that if you want to do an account of religious change which simply starts from religious factors and ends with religious factors, that's all right if that's the kind of historian or social scientist you are. And I want to go on to ask to suggest that in the Marxist materialistic theory of social change there seem to me to be two rather different elements, one of which is a purely empirical element, which I think came out in what Edward Thompson was saying this morning, which is very much like the Brodel three levels of change. It's simply saying that change in geology takes longer than change in social institutions, and therefore geological or ecological factors provide a sort of set of overarching constraints which you have to take into account when understanding the limits of variation of other things which are going on at more easily changeable levels. On the other hand, there also seems to me to be an element of sort of scientism in this, of scientific theories have to do with the sorts of things that natural science is about. I mean, I was trying to ask myself, in fact, what would, how far this kind of emphasis on material life was in fact due to a long period of comparatively poor technology. I mean, if you could imagine a society in which the technology was so superb that you could in fact change the material conditions of life quicker than you could make people adapt to them, would you then start changing your mind about which was the fundamental level for analysing social change, or would you in fact say, start to talk about a certain sort of innate conservatism as a physiological characteristic of the human mind? I mean, would one tend to redraw the boundary between science and social science in order to keep the scientific level as the more fundamental, just because we have this idea in our culture that nature is something unchanging and culture is something changing? Sorry, I don't know whether I made that clear enough.
This point I'd like to ask Leach his comments.
Well, you're really miles behind your programme, and maybe just drop out and then
Well, Jack had already suggested dropping out.
Up here.
Well, definitely as I should be changing gear somewhere.
Well,
so,
down here.
well, I want to devote my theoretical 10 minutes to a rather abstract argument, which is Well, it's sparked off in my mind by a remark in Maurice Bloch's Malinowski lecture, which has been circulated here. But I wrote this up this morning, and I think it does have some bearing on what Maurice Godelier said yesterday. Though I should emphasize that insofar as I referred to Godelier's paper, this paper, it is, I'm not in fact referring direct to the paper presentation, I'm referring rather explicitly to his own verbal condensation of it last night when he presented it in a particular way, and I was interested in how he presented it, which was slightly different to what the paper is itself. However, although the latter part of my paper is going to be very abstract, I would like to emphasize very strongly that I personally agree entirely with Jack Goody's earlier intervention this morning when this aspect of the concrete and the abstract came up in terms of Keith's paper. I'm saying that, you know, I mean, it's the sort of thing that Keith does, which I admire, rather than this highly abstract argument which I'm about to present myself. And I'd further, finally say that in terms of what's just been going on, that I have absolutely no concern with the subtleties of terminology of Marxism, about which I know very little. However, let's get on with it. As a one-time pupil of Malinowski, and I was a personal pupil of Malinowski, a good deal of what Maurice Godelier said last night struck me as curiously familiar. After all, the idea that social structures at the empirical level are manifested in reciprocities which, even though they appear to be asymmetrical to the external observer, are viewed as balanced reciprocities by the actors, is at least 50 years old. And the view that such rights and obligations, which are legitimate in the sense that they correspond to the consensus, the consent of those present, the consensus of what is acceptable, the view that such rights and obligations should be viewed as structures of indebtedness, which Godelier seemed to attribute to me, also goes back to Malinowski and in fact beyond. I'm not saying that there was nothing in Godelier's presentation of his paper which would not have seemed familiar to Malinowski, but the bits which were relatively new seemed to me of very doubtful acceptability, and here we're impinging on what was said just now by Tom Bottomore, that we were told in effect that while the various idioms or aspects of human action, kinship, religion, politics, economics and so on, are functionally intermeshed in any particular social context, one such idiom is dominant, and that this dominance can be recognized by inspection, and that we can detect what that dominance is by noting which idiom fulfills the function of production. Now, I personally don't believe that this dominance in this sense in fact amounts to anything more than a kind of impressionistic bias on the part of the anthropological or historical observer, but I don't want to argue about that because in fact we've been talking to some extent about that already this afternoon. I would also agree that with what an intervention by Ernest Gellner yesterday, that one of the most striking features of Godelier's paper and indeed of his presentation of it was the suggestion that if we accept the proposition that idiomatic dominance of the kind we've just been talking about can be detected, then very simple pre-capitalist economies are characteristically dominated by kinship, a point which Tom Bottomore apparently agreed with, that there has existed in history a type of pre-capitalist imperialism which was characteristically dominated by religion, and that it is only in, and here comes the crux, that it is only in capitalist societies in which accumulation and saving takes up more work, time, effort than subsistence, it's only here does the importance of kinship as a role allocation idiom recede into the background. Now this last, I think, is a very interesting proposition. I think it's quite invalid, and I think it can be shown to be invalid, but nevertheless it's something which I would have hoped we would have discussed, but we haven't discussed. I'm not going to talk about it. Okay. Now then, let's get down to my paper. I had no idea at all that the 1964 foreword of my Political Systems of Highland Burma, which is up there, was going to be circulated with the papers of this conference, or that the book itself would be used to exemplify this, that, or the other thing, as it was in several of yesterday's papers, although I was not when I was not here. Now, I would emphasize that that book was written more than 20 years ago, that it does not represent my present position about any anthropological issue, though it does represent a staging post in my journey to where I am now. In particular, it represents the point at which I began to think with increasing emotional passion that it is meaningless and thoroughly misleading to talk about cultures and societies in the plural, as I noticed that most people around this table have been doing in the last 2 days, including Godelier. The point is that this use of language, which has, of course, a very long tradition and derives, in my case, immediately from Radcliffe Brown, seems to presuppose that there always exists socio-economic political entities on the ground which have discernible boundaries in the manner of modern sovereign states. My own view, on the contrary, is that such bounded socio-political entities are, at the empirical level, something of an historical aberration, though I concede that human beings everywhere think of themselves as belonging to precisely such bounded, discriminated units. There are always people like us who are distinguished from people who are not like us. But it is only very seldom that, at an empirical level, in my view, people like us can be interpreted by an external observer as meaning members of a discriminated social political system on the ground. Now, Radcliffe Brown made the quite explicit assumption that precisely such an interpretation was indeed possible. If an Australian Aborigine informant told him, "We are the Carriera," he stated emphatically that he could infer from this that the Carriera were a tribe with a distinct set of tribal customs different from those of the non-Carriera. The relationships between members of the Carriera tribal system were those of consent. It was the domain of law. Relationships with members of other tribes were not governed by law, but by war. The principle of consent broke down. The domain was that of violence. But he did, it is true, sometimes recognize that since war itself is conducted according to customary conventions, it falls, in a sense, within a domain of law of some sort, and is therefore a special form of reciprocity involving consent. He didn't use precisely this terminology, but I've used the terminology so how it links up with what Godelier was saying yesterday. Now, my Political Systems of Highland Burma was an attempt to get away from this notion of tribes as bounded systems. It was correspondingly an attempt to get away from the idea that social structures, in the plural, exist as empirical detectable objects or entities in the world out there. I argued, rather, that the structure of a social system in which the actor exists is internalized in the actor's mind as a structure of interrelated concepts which can be, and indeed are necessarily, externalized in all sorts of manifest ways as interaction between man and between man and nature. I agree this is a simultaneous process, both the internalization and the externalization. Actor and observer alike can see the structure of the social system in the way individuals behave towards one another, in the way they construct and arrange their buildings, in the way they eat, in the work tasks they perform, and so on. But as we move across the map, and this is the crunch of the thing, different empirical sets of people can manifest essentially the same structure of internalized concepts in quite different ways, and this is true also of history. For example, the continuity of English society is not just that it exists in a particular territory, but that its members, in their own being, believe that there has been some sort of continuity of structure despite changes in the representation of that structure. Structure, thus conceived, is very abstract. it is a mesh indeed of the relations between relations of concepts in the mind. It is, and I will emphasize this, it isn't relations in the mind, it is relations between relations of concepts in the mind. It is, on the face of it, innately conservative, and here I come to Bloch's comment, and I said, started me off, I think, Leach's theory cannot account for the creation of new concepts, and why it can't do so is argued by Bloch in his essay. Now, how do I reply to that? Well, first of all, I would say that Bloch has misunderstood, or at least misrepresented my point. It is not the concepts as such which are permanent, but the total structure of relations between the concepts. Secondly, what matters here is what we mean by the distinction same and different. What is changing? And here, my own thinking is strictly topological, and it is here that we get perhaps unbearably abstract. I could have shown what I mean more easily if I had had a blackboard. In topological thinking, let's take diagram A, which we look at. Any closed mesh is the same as any other closed mesh. Thus, all these diagrams are topologically the same, whether it's a rectangle or a triangle or a circle or a diamond. They are closed systems, and they are the same in that sense. But they are all quite different. Those are all topologically the same because they are closed. If, however, we remove a bit of that, or remove a bit of that, remove a bit of that, or those are all different from the previous set, but they are all, again, like one another in that they are open systems. Now, this is the crunch, as it were, of what I'm trying to talk about. What really is this different? I hope the point is clear, really. As long as the system is closed, we are, in model terms, in a Malinowskian functionalist network. Every element in the system is interdependent with every other. You cannot, as it were, bend or move or any part of each of these systems without distorting the whole pattern. But if the system is not closed, then immediately we introduce a degree of freedom. For example, this particular limb can move up and down, it can move there, and the rest of the system is not distorted at all. And this applies to this limb, or every time we have an open system, the thing is bendable, and without introducing distortions into the rest of the structure. So this really is my answer to Bloch. First of all, I take the view that at the level of abstraction at which I'm now talking, the introduction, remember what his question was. Leach's theory cannot account for creation of new concepts. And first of all, I'm saying that it's not a question of so much of introducing new concepts, which can be introduced with greatest ease, but new structures. And the introduction of new structures is, in fact, very rare, because new structures are so transformable in terms of appearance that you very seldom introduce new structures. But if new structures are in fact introduced, this comes about through some empirical discovery. We reach a point where in the distortions of the original closed systems at which these are not infinitely distortable, because there comes a point at which some empirical observation simply cannot be made to fit even with the most distorted view of the existing pattern of structures. And since Bloch's paper was all about time, and he seemed to think that we have a universal concept of time, I have mentioned here that the concept of time in the theory relating to black holes, which is very much in vogue in this college, where a lot of black hole experts are concentrated, is a current example. Time in black hole theory simply has to be a new kind of time. It just cannot be fitted to any classical convention of time. Now, in more mundane affairs, it may well be, I'm not sure of this, but it could be so that the technological discoveries of the 17th and 18th century in the West has possibly introduced new ideas which simply could not be made to fit with the existing episteme as it was then. However much you distorted the existing complex of structures, the existing conservative system of ideas, there had to be a break, because it just couldn't distort that far to take into account these new empirical facts. But even then, and this is perhaps the only use of this model, change does not necessarily involve a revolutionary change either in perceived thinking or in political order. And here I would think it's useful to have this blackboard. I have a great book here. You can envisage, supposing we think of this complex as this closed system, stable, conservative complex as a diagram, and the thing is under tension of bending, but you can't distort it. And then there comes a crack in the system, as it were. At the point at which there comes a crack in the system, the observers will not necessarily notice anything. But once you've got this crack, once this crack has become a break, then in fact the system is completely altered. Because as soon as that crack has become a break, then whether the change has occurred or not, this whole limb is free to move, this whole limb is free to move, and you have got a whole set of breaks or further distortions of the system can then take place which are free. The break will not necessarily be immediately obvious to the other members of the system, that is to say, the other institutions of the system. It is only the consequences of the break, after the distortions have started taking place, namely that the constraints, and here this is where we tie back into what have been talked about before, that once such breaks occur, the constraints which formerly operated to keep the recalcitrant members of the system under control no longer operate. Violence, which in the previously, in the conservative structure, had in fact led to consent. When you get this break taking place, violence can still take place, but it will fail to lead to consent. And this is I don't know whether anybody can follow this kind of model making. I said I would talk at a very abstract level, and I've done so, but in my own thinking, this follows on directly from what we were talking about yesterday evening and today.
Would somebody like to comment on that?
Can I just make two very quick comments? I mean, I think, since we haven't got much time to discuss it, well, I could just say, since Professor Leach has been using concepts and structure rather differently than I do, as you pointed out earlier, I could then just simply rephrase my question that his theory cannot account why cracks in the circles and triangles occur. I mean, he said that's a fundamental thing. This is which I think would equal more or less what I meant by his theory not being able to account for changes in concepts. And I was trying to suggest that in order to understand how cracks in the system, let's say, occur, is if available concepts if concepts are available to people within a culture which do not imply a particular semantic relation.
Cracks arise from empirical changes, namely that, I mean, you may get demographic changes, quantitative changes, which make a previously existing system intolerable. You may get a new scientific discovery which simply won't fit what you thought you knew before.
Could I just stand there? I mean, I would agree with this, but the problem is that cracks arise from empirical phenomena, you said, from empirical changes. But that's not enough, because empirical phenomena have to be known in order to, it's not just, it's not just good enough to, I mean...
Well, but if you are researching into...
And they have to be known in terms of new concepts.
No, but if you are researching into how to make a weaving machinery or a spinning machinery, and you actually manage to do so, you've made a discovery. You've been using previously existing concepts in order to explore how to make a more efficient spinning machine. But then you actually make the more efficient spinning machine, and you introduced a set of empirical facts which cannot be tolerated by the existing structure.
And then you need new concepts. And these concepts cannot come directly from experience. I mean, concepts don't just grow out of empirical phenomena.
No, but what then? It isn't the new concept. The concepts are changing all the time. It's the relation. It's the structure within the concepts that are changing. Concepts change completely from the 15th century to the 17th century. I mean, all sorts of concepts change, but it's the relationship between the concepts that is tied in at a structural level, at an episteme level.
I mean, that's obviously right, but let's think of... I don't know if...
I don't think this is a private argument.
Perhaps we should... let me just say, follow it on, perhaps later on privately, since I think you probably write things, etc. Could I say another thing? Is that I'd just like to draw your attention to note 7, where I say, I am not making the empiricist mistake of thinking that concepts, as concepts, are given in nature. I am only talking of the constraints of nature on thought, given the human condition. In this I am following Piaget in 1968. It would be nonsense to say that our everyday concepts of time are true concepts of time, the notions of time held by physicists, and not remotely like our own like our folk notions of time. So I just point that out to say that I have considered this.
The physicist notion of time are folk notions of physicists.
Yeah, but presumably you're talking about the black holes.
Well, they're folk notions.
I mean,
they're no truer than anyone else's.
No, right.
No, right.
I think at this point the best thing to do, if other people do not immediately want to comment on Edmund Leach's paper, is I'll ask Jack Goody to make his comments and then throw the discussion wide open for anything that people feel ought to be said before we break up, whether it arises from this afternoon or not. Jack Goody.
There seem to be a lot of things that ought to be said, but I'm not going to say them. In the sense that we really have covered an extremely small gamut of possible discussions of social theory. And have concentrated attention, obviously, on various abstract levels, which in a sense I'm afraid I'm going to continue, but with, for a few moments, anyhow, but just to raise one or 2 points, I think, that that strike me forcibly as somebody who is interested in problems to do with change in the third world at the moment, which is very much more rapid, I think, changes that are going on, of a structural and empirical character, however one wants to describe these, than have been going, have happened elsewhere, and it's really one of the dominant phenomena of our present world, obviously, is the extreme rapid nature of social change that is going on there. And if one looks at that kind of situation, one is forced very much to differentiate social change in a whole variety of ways, which I'm not going to do now, in terms of cyclical changes and non-cyclical changes, of changes which are related to other aspects of the social system in the kind of functional way that Ernest Gellner has mentioned, to others, and I tried to discriminate these in a very minor way in a publication I did on different inheritance systems, and one that seemed to me to be autonomous, to be unrelated to other aspects of the social system. I think we really haven't given much attention to that. We can disguise these, I think, or we can say, and it seems to me a legitimate argument from one point of view to say, that the kind of variations of, for example, a myth that I happen to be analysing at the moment are all, different versions of the same myth. But I think that leaves open to me, anyhow, a great number of questions. I think they're the ones that Maurice and Edmund touched upon now, of the whole problem of the generative aspects of social relationships, and the fact that in all social relationships people are acting in generative ways, and I believe this to be true even of societies that are relatively stable in inverted commas. Obviously it's a variable, but I do believe it to be true of relatively stable societies. And so there really are a whole lot of different phenomena, I think, which one is discussing under the rubric of social change. And it therefore is no surprise to me that there can be, in my view, no such thing as a theory of social change. I mean, I think it is a level of abstraction that dealing with social phenomena, one cannot have one theory. I mean, I can't imagine what it would look like even if we had it there. So that when one is talking about social change, one is talking about very different kinds of organizational change, structural change, so forth. One was dealing with the relative autonomy of different aspects of the social system. And one is also, of course, dealing with levels of the theory, levels of the model, there, in the way that Bottomore and Keith Hopkins have been discussing. And I think that my own view is that unless one brings it down to some kind of level of the kind that Keith Hopkins is discussing, that that one is really going to get very little change out of the situation. I mean, change in the other sense of the word. And to think that 7 pages on 200 years of Roman history is a sort of empiricist discussion seems to be like claiming that Marx's analysis of 150 years of capitalism is an empiricist discussion of capitalism, and it's high-level abstraction there, dealing with important variables and keeping at the center of consideration, and I say at the center and not at the top or the bottom deliberately, aspects of the reproduction of material life and the mode of production, which is what I understand by the one aspect, one valuable aspect of the crystallization of Marxist theory, but I really don't want to get into discussion of Marxist theory since we've been going around that for some time, except on this level, this aspect of the levels of the model here. I really again wonder how much profit there is discussing the problem of the domination of institutional categories, in the sense reverting to Tom Bottomore's point, because although in teaching social anthropology we teach papers in politics, economics, kinships and religion in that way, and have several papers on this, it has always seemed to me that these were notional distinctions, and I can't see them hardening. I mean, I see them hardening in a sense in 19th, 20th century European societies. I don't see them as institutional, as formally institutionally separate in societies that I have myself worked in. It isn't simply that kinship. It isn't simply that kinship is dominant. is that it is impossible to distinguish between kinship, say, and economic and political roles in certain societies. I mean, that it is, there is no point in distinguishing them from any analytic purpose whatsoever that I can see. It is quite true that those, if you like, undifferentiated institutions there are playing, of course, the part that Maurice describes in marriage and filiation and so forth. They're also involved in the economy, as we would, in the reproduction of material life. But it isn't, one cannot talk in that sense, I think, in any sensible way about domination there. It just doesn't, it doesn't leave me with any feeling of analytic satisfaction if I try to do that. I can see perfectly well that at certain given historical moments that, as others have said, that it may be possible to do this, but it does seem to me that it has to be tied in with given historical situations, and that is again why I cannot see that in terms of however one redefines dominant, that one can have a general theory in that sense which is going to be terribly satisfactory. The other problem and aspects of the analysis of social change that I myself have since been involved with in contemporary situations is again the whole problem of which other people have discussed and which I don't see the easy way out of, which do involve a matter of judgment, of assessment, of weighting, even possibly of measurement in quotes by the analyzer at different points of time. And this is the assessment of change, of the nature of change, of actually giving some weighting to different elements in the model one is in. I mean, there's that aspect of model or theory building there, and there's the aspect that others have referred to of where to break into the circle. I mean, unless we break into the circle, we are, I think, in the sort of functionalist, in the functionalist dilemma that many of us would like to get out of. The second general point, the others covered rather many, but the second general point I wanted to make was that if one looks at new nations particularly, one is really concerned, of course, with internal changes, but one is concerned very much more with exogenous factors in the situation. I mean, the first industrial nation has particular problems of its own in being the first industrial nation, and every other nation after that is not the first industrial nation. They are no longer the first industrial nation by definition. So that immediately, and directly this happens to agricultural societies or any level of change like that, one is a situation in the world in which one has to deal not simply, of course, with unitary systems which help you break out, but with what various people have called the articulation of modes of production, the contact between systems in very real senses. And nobody conceivably has worked in the third world without having very forcibly to realize that this aspect of the relationship, the articulation, if you want, or the conflict, I mean, both between different, if I may call them, systems of social relationship rather than societies or cultures, in order to get out of Edmund's situation there, I mean, really is a fundamental problem in social change for anyone who is looking at that. And the third point I want to mention is that I think that in some discussions this has happened, for example, in Parsons' discussions of social change insofar as he has one. But I think it is also true of other structural function analysis, and I use this in a wide sense to include many linguistic analyses, is that to some extent the problem of social change gets confused may not be quite the right word here, with the problem of transformations. People tend to try and deal. I mean, Parsons actually makes this equivalent of one particular time. One is not dealing with the one is not dealing with the same problem there. The problem of transformations has its own value, especially in exploring a set of limited possibilities. But there is great danger, I think, in allowing the notion of transformation to be seen as a substitute for the analysis of social change and the assessment of the particular sets of relationships, sets of relationship that lead to, if you like the choice, I use the word in a rather deliberate, in a very simple-minded way, between sets of alternatives under particular situations. In order to make some assessment of the kinds of changes, of the situations under which A changes to B, however one wants to find A and B, then we need to analyze, firstly, the possibilities of variations in social formations. Secondly, we need to do these in the light of a range of productive, though I would give productive a central significance here, and other variables that are associated with shifts from one possibility to another. Thirdly, we need to take account at the same time of relevant long-term directional factors which are involved in social change. And I think that it is here, I think, that social anthropology, or asocial anthropology, which is at once deeply empirical in one sense and is also theoretical in a comparative sense, whatever sort of comparison one is adopting, I think approaches the academic field of history, but works at a different level of analysis and can make, I think, its own contribution to the analysis of social change in the kind of way, I think, that Keith Hopkins did so admirably this morning, that in a sense gives one a framework for discussing variables in the situation of servitude or slavery or dependent labor. I mean, I agree absolutely with Edmund's problem about, the definition of slavery here. It seems to me that one can, without going into legal, factors of legal definition there, see and define similarities of process in the production and the reproduction of servile labor, which do crop up in different parts of the world. One can ask questions as to what difference it makes when you bring in tribal groups in the way that Ernest and Edmund were talking about there, or when you do more deliberately go out raiding on annual raiding systems, or you get the Thracians or the Scythians to do it for you, and pull in individuals as individuals in that way who are depersonalized in that way. Because obviously, to take one of Keith's points that he made about the functions of slavery in the Roman system, that the long-distance mobility is achieved in one case, but obviously not so easily in the other case. I mean, he's stripping them down like that. I mean, he gets this business, he can move them about and shift them about like pawns in that way, like pawns in a game of chess, that way, and move them about there. Another aspect in that sense of the mobility of labour, a rather different sense from the geographical one, that Keith didn't mention in that context, but which has very much impressed me in Africa, and I think it would in other, in Jamaican slavery, certainly this is true, and that is that the slavery cross-cut completely the normal, in quotes, division of labour. That is to say, slaves performed female and male tasks. I mean, you see them, pictures of them carrying wood and so on in Africa and water, which no male would do, no free male would do under any circumstance. And of course, they were employed again on one of the arguments that Dunn and others have produced for the lower fertility of slave populations in on Jamaican plantations, were that more women were employed directly in productive tasks there, and that they had a productive role to play in cutting sugarcane there, and therefore were presumably had a great number of more stillbirths or abortions under that situation. So I think that one can, at that level, begin to look at problems to do with differences and social change, and when one gets down to that level of analysis, that I find very difficult to discuss at the higher one, just because it seems to me that one is dealing with such a wide range of social phenomena there, which are not really amenable to the kind of verbal intercourse in which we are engaging today. Thank you.
Just a small footnote on this specific distinction which Edmund and Jeff thought about the implications of the difference between block purchase and individual purchase of specialized personnel. The level at which it was introduced is one level at which it operates, namely when you're buying cultivators or occupiers of lowly posts. Obviously it makes a big difference whether you buy individual slaves and then you can have an estate with which you switch labour from their end roles, or whether you conquer entire population and, as Edmund described, make them settle in a given area and then pay you tax, but leave them to run themselves. Well, it's an interesting distinction because also, it also arises at completely different levels in the society. If one works on any kind of typology of Muslim societies, I've come to think that the real important distinction in traditional Muslim polities is between what might be called the Ibn Khaldun type of Islamic state and the Turanian one. But the difference is precisely this one. That I'd say Turanian, Ottoman, I want to have some term which includes the Ottomans and the Mamluks.
I see. I thought it was Turan in a...
No. I'm referring to the ethnic...
Oh, you did too. I'm glad I wasn't the only one. I was trying to locate
I'm sorry.
it. I couldn't understand. Yes. Okay.
Nothing hinges on the name, but the Ibn Khaldun state, of course, works by the fact you import your rulers en bloc at the tribal group, or rather you don't import them, they just come whether they're asked or not. And they rule in virtue of their previous cohesion. And the disadvantage of the system is that they lose it whilst they're doing the job, and they have to be replaced periodically. And has the great disadvantage, of course, is that the ruler is encumbered. The ruler, in the narrower sense, is encumbered by a lot of heavy kin obligations. And it seems to be that the alternative way to do it, best developed by the Ottomans, but obviously existing in the Mamluk form before them, is to buy your rulers one by one on the slave markets of the Black Sea or the Caucasus, import them, or just recruit them individually. The recruiting agents used to go around in Anatolia, I gather from a Turkish historian, and drum and say, if you want a comfortable life, come and be one of the rulers in Algeria and Tunisia. And they would then come one by one, and the great advantage of them would be, of course, that they would have no local kin links. And again, they would be more switchable occupationally. And anyway, it's a minor point, but the division between individual and bulk purchase exists very much at the top as well as at the bottom, and it's an interesting one full of implications. End of footnote.
Or maybe something else.
I mean, Jack's level of rational discourse, in fact, fitted what I was saying fairly well. But may I just say something to Maurice Bloch about this business of concepts. Of course, at the level of new concepts in these technical discovery situations, what you use are metaphors. And this is, in fact, beautifully illustrated by what, in fact, happened in the textile industry in England. Two of the key inventions, and they were inventions, I mean, in Jack's sense, they were not, well, somebody's mule and somebody's spinning jenny. I think the mule came first and then the spinning jenny. And of course, people, if you just think about spinning jenny, you think it must be something to do with a woman. But in fact, the point is that jenny is the female mule. And you're taking over from farming. You've got some new gadgets, which are automatic gadgets, and they're labor-saving gadgets. And you can't fit them into your homemade package, sort of cottage industry. So you bring in some terminology about farm animals, and they're reciprocal animals. See, the mule and the jenny is the opposite to a mule. I mean, a mule is a sterile male, and the jenny is the sterile female. I think that's right. The jenny, it's the jackass, and the jenny is the. Let's see. A mule is an offspring of a female donkey and a male horse, isn't it? And the jenny is the offspring of a female horse and a male donkey. I think it's that way around. I mean, they're reciprocal concepts. It's exactly the way that ideas develop.
Look, could I just say one thing? Of course, I'm not denying that you can't have new concepts. I mean, what I was trying to do is to understand, in fact, how they come about. What I had a feeling was that in your scheme, and when we're talking about in the scheme in political system of Heidelberg, which I take as my starting point, because when we're looking at social concepts, which after all is what I was talking about in that part, one can't understand, for example, how you break out of the categorization of people between Mayu and Dharma from your schema. Though obviously we know that people break out of that kind of thing. This is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And we know that, any changes in the demographic situation can be still put in this opposition between Mayu and Dharma. In fact, you show this very interestingly in your book. How completely different systems of social organization, you can still work this opposition between Mayu and Dharma. And it seemed to me that still, I think I would say that within the schema that you propose, one cannot understand how you break out of Mayu Dharma. You do lots of other things, but I just was trying to point out the limit of what you're doing. Well, let me stress again that I do think, you see, that the problem is that people do get new concepts, and the only way they can get new concepts is by challenging inconsistent systems.
It's a problem if you're thinking of bounded systems, you see.
Well, I'm saying you've got a conceptual bounded system, ultimately at that very high level, where you say that within that area, kinsmen are arranged between Mayu and Dharma.
I don't. Not true.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's Godelier.
It was a nice point in Edmund Leach's statement, because he kept saying that there is no such thing as closed system, and he used always a closed system to demonstrate, the change. It was very interesting. I mean, you kept saying that there is no such thing as closed units, and I do agree with you. We are talking about societies and cultures, and I think that it's metaphor. We are using metaphors. I never thought myself that exists really closed society, independent from each other and so on. I think nobody thinks that here around the table. At the same time, you were using a closed model with a break coming sometime.
No, well, my point is that by using this plural language, and it's very beautifully illustrated by Maurice Bloch's lecture and by his whole, you are immediately, by using this kind of metaphor, you are immediately forced by the complex of your language into all the time thinking in terms of closed systems. And you never, in fact, bring into consideration precisely the kind of exegenic factors Jack was talking about, where there are all the time explanations, the real explanations are because things external to the historical situation are coming in.
I think we do agree, but I think external factors or internal factors, they do reveal, I don't care very much with external and internal, because they do reveal the same properties of social relationships. Exactly. I don't care with external or internal factor. I am never involved with this.
The difference is in terms of your concept of consent.
Yeah. I mean, no, because at the end, from external factors like French colonization or from internal factors, you discover something, the same properties of relationships to move or to not move. I mean, it's limited possibilities of properties of societies to change or to not change in some direction or another one,
Maurice, I think that's true at a very high level of generation. Sorry.
Yes, but I have not quite finished. Look, because I come back to a point where I feel a boundary You say dominance of an idiom you say, or idiomatic dominance. So in fact you rephrase what I have said in something I cannot understand.
Well,
and it was exactly the same yesterday. He told me, Maurice, the people around the table, they could not understand you because you speak with French words like dominance of kinship.
No, I didn't.
And in fact,
come on.
so yes, and in fact, in order to translate you, I have used idiom and function. Well, it's just not what I try to say. It is to come back to boundaries between cultures and languages, you know. When I speak about dominance of kinship, I speak of dominance of real institutions, ideas, ideologies, and to come back to the point, Jack Goody seems to not understand what means dominance of kinship. Well, to me, from what I have read and from my own experience among the Baruya, excuse me, I am very peculiar in my examples, but I see when the people do think of themselves are being predominantly impulsed by kinship problem, or I should say everything takes the form of a kinship problem. I mean, something happens to them, bad harvest, it is because the affines have worked sorcery on them, so it takes the form of a kinship problem. But you cannot reduce, I mean, kinship to just marriage and descent. Kinship, you cannot, you know, you say, I don't understand quite.
Well,
Why can't you equally describe it as a political system?
There's no
Why
problem.
can't you equally describe it as politics?
Yeah, there's no problem. I mean, when I say you can't discuss the dominance of the kinship system in that sense, because what is it dominant over? I mean, the kinship system is also the economic system. And it's also, I mean, you say that people, you know, look at productive relationships in kinship terms. Perfectly true.
Yes,
but I mean, they're performing because in what is loosely called domestic mode of production, I mean, they're working together, and their kinship relationships are also at that level economic relationships. They're involved in the division of labour and so forth. But I myself don't really find much profit in describing that as the dominance of kinship relations, because it seems to me that political relationships in a functional sense are also being carried out by those same units, and so are economic units.
Yes.
It is true that for rather specific reasons, these are, you know, but are also father and son are working together.
But it is, we get to the point, it's very difficult
Yeah.
there, because political authorities take the form of kinship relationships. To cooperate takes the form of bringing together relatives. To work. To make love is something between possible relatives.
Why should you not say that kinship relations take the form of political relations? I mean,
Could I just say one thing? I perhaps was overgenerous in my translation of you, because I think it is an interesting question when we put it in terms of idiom, because I think it is an interesting question why an idiom
it is not a
which
matter
has
of language.
associations with
It's not a matter of
filiation
language.
and marriage.
It's not a matter of phrasing the relationships.
Not as a system. I mean, Jack is right, but I mean, if we talk about an idiom, I think there is an
I
interesting.
see why it's used as...
Even if it is an idiom, it is a language to phrase everything kinship, but it is the language that people use, and we have to explain, just like the Prime Mover this morning, why everything takes the form of kinship relationship and why they do speak about themselves. I am dealing with the way the people speak about themselves. They do speak in kinship terms. They call God Father. I mean, everything is kinship terms. It is not true in our society, so I cannot say political relationship take the form of kinship. It's not true. I have to understand why kinship is the dominant language to deal with everything, and it is not language at the same time. I mean, it is beyond language, the foundation of language. So, I don't know.
You're using the notion of dominance in two different ways, because on the one hand you're saying that in some systems everything is put in the idiom of kinship. On the other hand, I mean, you know, if you want to say that in classical Athens everything is put in the idiom of politics, this is simply false. What is useful about the notion of dominance for analysing classical Athens is that in my view and in the view of some other people, certain things like the circulation of money, the level of trade, the way in which the market system works and so on, which appear to be prima facie purely economic things which one might try to explain out of a sort of autonomous development, can in fact be explained much better if you put them in relation to the political system, and that, I think, is what the sort of thing that Keith was doing with his model.
Yeah.
That was why he was perfectly right to say, that I mean, the question of dominance didn't really, was irrelevant to him. I mean, I find it useful because, I mean, there are quite a lot of ancient historians, actually, who still think economic history is banks and money and markets and trade, and is nothing to do with war or booty or taxation or tribute, and therefore, as a sort of polemical or expository point, this idea of dominance is useful. But there one is saying, that this is a sort of analytical dominance. You can't understand these other things, really, unless you relate them to the political system. But this is not the idiom in which the people doing it are talking about it. In fact, the separation between the apparently political and the apparently economic is a thing that the Greeks themselves made, and which one is trying to get behind in order to understand what is going on.
I think it's a different thing, as Harry says. I mean, if you've got, dominance is a different thing if you've got differentiation, institutional differentiation, than if you've got a lack of differentiation.
Yeah.
I mean, if everything is squashed into one, as it were, I mean, that's
so
the,
in fact we are dealing with different examples, not
right.
with
I mean,
different definitions, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Because
this is true. We're dealing with
if I have been told by Vernon and others, even religion in Greek society was redefined, and the temples were redefined because of the political domination, of the domination of politics. So the previous religious feelings and ideas have been redefined with the appearance of the city-state. I mean, so everything was
not rephrased in a different idiom.
No, but the same, not the same place, not the same architecture, and so on.
Well, actually, very nearly. I would simply like to put on record what seems to me the paradox which has emerged from these 2 days as a whole. Personally, I enjoy it simply as an observer. That is, on one side, I mean, we had 2 concrete models of change, one the Athenian one and the other the Roman one, which managed to bypass ideologies. On the other hand, we had a main paper on ideology, we managed to bypass change. Both types of papers have also managed to bypass revolution. There's a very specific type of change, both of consent and of institutions. And I leave you to meditate on this paradox.
Perhaps we should bypass further discussion.
It was the best conclusion possible.
Yes, I think
Splendid.
Revolutions wouldn't get bypassed.
yes, we were a little soft on the hard stuff. A revolution.
Revolutions, they're the problem.
Pardon?
Revolutions,
no, they're the easy bit. You might be right, but they're the easy bit.
I'm delighted I could quite general theory.